Why do intelligent people reject evidence? Why do highly educated, well-informed individuals defend ideas that contradict data? Why do corrections sometimes make belief stronger? We often assume that more intelligence means more rationality, but psychology suggests something more uncomfortable. The human mind is not built primarily for truth. It is built for coherence. When evidence threatens a belief tied to identity, the mind does not calmly revise itself. It defends. And the smarter you are, the better you may be at defending it. This is called cognitive dissonance, and it doesn't just shape personal beliefs. It shapes politics, it shapes movements, and it can be exploited. In this video, we'll explore why intelligent people reject evidence and how populists and authoritarians understand this better than most. Because the battle for power is often not about facts, it's about protecting identity. Welcome to Deep Context. To understand why intelligent people reject evidence, we need to start with a theory from 1957. Psychologist Leon Festinger called it cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort we feel when two beliefs collide, or when a belief collides with evidence. It is the tension between what we think is true and what appears to be true. Festinger did not develop this idea in abstraction. He tested it. In one of the most famous studies in social psychology, he and his colleagues infiltrated a small religious group. This group believed the world would end on a specific date. A flying saucer, they were told, would rescue the faithful. The date came. The prophecy failed. The world did not end. Logically, this should have destroyed the belief. It did not. Instead, many members became even more convinced. They reinterpreted the failed prophecy as proof of their importance. Their faith, they claimed, had saved the world. The contradiction did not collapse the belief. It strengthened it. This is cognitive dissonance in action. When belief and reality clash, the mind experiences discomfort, and that discomfort demands resolution. There are only three ways to resolve it. 1. Change the belief. 2. Reject the evidence. 3. Reinterpret the information so it fits. Changing a belief is the most costly option. Beliefs are rarely isolated facts. They are connected to identity, to belonging, to moral orientation, to social relationships, to our sense of self. Rejecting evidence is easier. Reinterpreting evidence is easier still, because reinterpretation preserves identity. Changing belief threatens stability. Reinterpreting evidence protects identity. And this is the critical insight. Dissonance feels like danger. Resolution feels like relief. The mind is not primarily asking, "Is this true?" It is asking, "Can I live with this?" And once we understand that, the rejection of evidence becomes less mysterious. It becomes human. If cognitive dissonance affects all of us, then intelligence should protect us. That is the comforting assumption. More education, more analytical skill, more exposure to information. Surely that produces more rational conclusions. But the research suggests something counterintuitive. In many political psychology studies, higher cognitive ability does not reduce bias. In some contexts, it can intensify it. Not because intelligent people are less rational, but because they are more capable. Capable of building arguments, capable of selecting evidence, capable of noticing flaws, especially in opposing claims, and capable of defending a position so well that it begins to feel unshakable. This is sometimes described as motivated reasoning. We like to imagine reasoning as a neutral engine, but in practice, reasoning often behaves like a lawyer. It does not ask, "What is true?" It asks, "What can I defend?" And the more intelligent you are, the better that lawyer becomes. Consider the practical difference between ignorance and intelligence. Ignorance can't always produce a coherent defense. It can only repeat slogans. But intelligence can produce something far more persuasive: a story. A story that integrates conflicting facts. A story that explains away contradictions. a story that keeps identity intact. This is why intelligence can be a double-edged sword. It increases the ability to think, but it also increases the ability to rationalize. And here's the deeper problem. Most of what we call rationality in everyday life is not the pursuit of truth. It's the pursuit of coherence. Coherence feels like stability. Coherence feels like maturity. Coherence feels like control. So when evidence threatens coherence, intelligence often goes to work, not to update the model, but to repair it, to protect it, to keep the story standing. This can look like many things. You can downplay inconvenient facts. You can question the credibility of the source. You can shift standards of proof. You can demand perfect certainty from opposing evidence while accepting weak evidence for your side. You can focus on exceptions instead of the pattern. You can change the definition of the claim mid-discussion. And if you're intelligent, you can do all of that gracefully. You can do it without sounding irrational. Analytical skill can become ideological armor. This leads to a critical philosophical point. Reason is a tool. It does not decide its own purpose. Intelligence gives you power over arguments, but it doesn't tell you what you owe the truth. Intelligence can serve truth, or it can serve identity. And this is the uncomfortable insight. The smarter you are, the better you are at constructing internal consistency, even when the foundation is wrong. Because internal consistency feels like rationality, even when it is built around an assumption that cannot be questioned. That is the danger, not stupidity, but the ability to defend a belief so effectively that it becomes immune to revision. Which brings us to the next layer, because the strongest beliefs are not just intellectual, they are social, they are moral, they are tied to belonging. They become identity. Up to this point, we've been talking about cognition, beliefs, evidence, reasoning. But politics is rarely just about cognition. It is about identity. And identity does not float freely. It is structured, organized, stabilized through ideology. In political philosophy, ideology is often treated as a system of ideas. But psychologically, it functions as something deeper. It provides moral clarity. It tells you what is right and wrong. It provides narrative coherence. It explains why the world looks the way it does. It offers group belonging. It tells you who stands with you and who stands against you. It provides emotional security. It reduces ambiguity. And perhaps most importantly, it provides a map of reality. Human beings do not navigate raw complexity very well. The world is chaotic. Information is overwhelming. Events are unpredictable. Ideology simplifies. It selects. It organizes. It tells you what matters. In stable times, ideology is one lens among many. In unstable times, it becomes refuge. Economic insecurity, cultural change, technological disruption, geopolitical tension. When uncertainty rises, the need for coherence intensifies, and ideology becomes shelter. But shelter has a cost. When ideology fuses with identity, disagreement no longer feels like disagreement. It feels like destabilization. Disagreement becomes threat. Evidence becomes intrusion. Critique becomes attack. At this point, we enter a concept known as identity-protective cognition. The idea is simple but powerful. When a belief is tied to group identity, the mind protects the group before it evaluates the claim. We do not ask, "Is this true?" We ask, "Is this aligned with who I am?" If a claim supports our group, it feels plausible. If a claim threatens our group, it feels suspect. Not because we have evaluated all the data, but because belonging carries emotional weight. To revise a belief under these conditions is not merely to update information, it is to risk social friction, to risk isolation, to risk moral uncertainty. And the human nervous system treats social instability as danger. So coherence is defended, not only intellectually, but socially, emotionally, existentially. This is why arguments in polarized environments so rarely change minds, because the debate is not happening at the level of facts, it is happening at the level of identity. And once identity is at stake, politics changes, because politics becomes less about persuasion and more about protection. Once ideology becomes shelter, politics becomes psychological terrain. And this is where certain political actors operate with precision. Populism thrives on simplification, not because complexity doesn't exist, but because complexity creates dissonance. Modern societies are layered. Economic systems are abstract. Institutions are distant. Policies are technical. Ambiguity is everywhere, and ambiguity is uncomfortable. Populist movements understand this discomfort. They do not increase complexity, they reduce it. They create a strong in-group identity, a clear we. They frame critics as corrupt elites, a clear they. They portray institutions, courts, media, universities, bureaucracies as hostile or compromised. They narrow the field of trust. And then they offer something psychologically powerful, emotionally satisfying explanations. Economic stagnation, it's betrayal. Cultural change, it's invasion. Policy failure, it's sabotage. Complex systems are translated into moral narratives, and moral narratives are easier to defend than technical arguments. But the most powerful mechanism is this: immediate resolution of cognitive discomfort. When followers experience dissonance, when evidence contradicts belief, the leader intervenes. It's fake. They're lying. You're being manipulated. In 3 sentences, coherence is restored. The discomfort dissolves. The identity remains intact. This is psychologically efficient. It requires no revision of worldview, no uncertainty, no self-doubt, only reinforcement. Populism offers emotional certainty in complex environments. It reduces ambiguity, and ambiguity is uncomfortable. When institutions are complicated and outcomes are unclear, certainty becomes attractive, even if that certainty is constructed. And here is the structural insight. Populism does not eliminate cognitive dissonance, it manages it, it redirects it, it gives it a target. The discomfort is no longer internal, it is externalized, blamed on enemies, on elites, on outsiders, on conspirators. And once dissonance is externalized, loyalty deepens, because the leader becomes not just a political figure, but a stabilizing force. Populism manages cognitive dissonance mainly through rhetoric. Authoritarianism goes further. It builds structures around it. Because rhetoric can resolve discomfort temporarily, but institutions can reshape the conditions under which people decide what is real. Authoritarian systems do not rely only on emotion. They redesign the information environment. They make certainty easier than doubt, and they make doubt feel unsafe. One method is undermining independent media, not always through censorship, sometimes through discrediting, sometimes through intimidation, and often through saturation. If you cannot silence critical voices, you can drown them, fill the space with noise, contradictory claims, endless scandals, alternative experts, so many versions of reality that verification becomes exhausting. When the information environment becomes tiring, people stop checking, they start choosing, and what they choose is what feels safe. Authoritarian systems also attack neutral arbiters of truth: courts, universities, journalists, civil servants, scientific institutions, election monitors, not necessarily to abolish them at first, but to erode their legitimacy, to turn trust into suspicion. And once the public becomes suspicious of every referee, every claim becomes partisan. Every correction becomes agenda. Every fact becomes spin. This is the point where cognitive dissonance becomes political fuel, because dissonance is easier to endure when you can blame it on an enemy. Another strategy is blurring fact and fiction. Contradiction becomes normal. Statements are made, then reframed. Promises are issued, then revised. Policies change, then the change is denied. To an outside observer, this looks like chaos, but psychologically, it performs a function. It trains people to stop expecting consistency, and once consistency is no longer expected, evidence loses leverage. Because evidence depends on stable standards. If standards shift, proof becomes optional. Authoritarian systems then reward loyalty over accuracy. They signal, openly or subtly, that what matters is alignment, not precision, not truth, not even coherence, alignment. This is why supporters can hold contradictory beliefs and still feel stable, because the stability comes from identity, not from logic. This is where Hannah Arendt's insight becomes useful. She observed that totalitarian movements do not thrive because citizens believe every official claim. They thrive when citizens lose trust in reality itself, when people conclude, everyone lies, nothing can be known, no source is neutral. That sounds like skepticism, but it is actually surrender. Because when everything is suspect, loyalty becomes the only stable anchor. At that point, evidence loses power, not because it disappears, but because identity replaces it. If no source can be trusted, then the only reliable reference point becomes the group, the leader, the movement, the community that promises certainty. And the function of propaganda changes. It is no longer primarily to convince you of a specific claim. It is to convince you that truth is inaccessible without allegiance. That is institutionalized dissonance, a society trained to tolerate contradiction as long as it comes from the right side. And once a population is trained this way, political conflict stops being a debate over shared facts. It becomes a competition between realities. And when reality fragments, democracy weakens, because democracy requires something fragile, a shared baseline of truth. It's important to pause here, because cognitive dissonance is not a partisan defect. It is not a flaw of one movement, one ideology, or one political camp. It is human. It affects left-wing movements. It affects right-wing movements. It affects nationalists. It affects technocrats. It affects religious communities. It affects secular ideologues. No ideology is immune. Every belief system creates internal coherence. Every movement develops sacred assumptions. Every group defines certain claims as foundational. And once a belief becomes foundational, questioning it feels destabilizing. Progressives can rationalize inconvenient data. Conservatives can rationalize institutional failures. Technocrats can dismiss public concern as ignorance. Nationalists can reinterpret economic complexity as betrayal. Religious groups can protect doctrine. Secular movements can protect moral certainty. The mechanism is the same. The danger does not come from the existence of ideology. Ideology is unavoidable. The danger increases when polarization intensifies, when groups stop interacting across difference, when social networks become homogeneous, when information ecosystems separate. And most critically, when trust declines. If citizens lose trust in institutions, lose trust in media, lose trust in expertise, lose trust in one another, then identity becomes the only stable anchor. Under those conditions, dissonance is not processed collectively, it is processed tribally. And when that happens, evidence becomes ammunition, not illumination. Facts are selected, not examined. Arguments are performed, not explored. The issue is not that people care too much about their beliefs. The issue is that in polarized environments, belief becomes armor. And when belief becomes armor, truth becomes secondary. Democracy is not sustained by elections alone. It rests on psychological foundations. Democracies require shared factual baselines, not perfect agreement, but enough common ground to argue within the same reality. They require institutional trust. Trust that courts apply rules consistently. Trust that journalists verify information. Trust that data has meaning. They require a willingness to revise beliefs, the capacity to say, I may have been wrong. And they require tolerance of ambiguity, the ability to live with complexity, with uncertainty, with incomplete knowledge. Cognitive dissonance strains all four. When shared facts become partisan, the baseline fractures. When institutions are framed as corrupt by default, trust erodes. When belief is fused with identity, revision feels like betrayal. When ambiguity becomes intolerable, simplification becomes seductive. And when dissonance is constantly exploited, through media cycles, through outrage economies, through political messaging, politics transforms. It becomes narrative competition, not policy debate. The question is no longer what works. It becomes which story feels coherent. In that environment, the loudest coherence wins. Not necessarily the most accurate, not necessarily the most effective, but the most emotionally stable. And a democracy governed by emotional coherence is far more fragile than one governed by shared inquiry. So we return to the question, why do intelligent people reject evidence? Not because they are incapable of reasoning, not because they lack information, not because they are uniquely irrational, but because intelligence protects coherence. And coherence protects identity. And identity protects belonging. The mind is not built to abandon what anchors it. It is built to preserve what stabilizes it. The more intelligent we are, the more capable we become of defending that stability, of constructing explanations, of maintaining internal consistency, even when revision might be healthier. So the question is not, why are they irrational? The better question is, what ideas would we struggle to abandon? What evidence would make us uncomfortable? What belief, if challenged, would feel like a threat to who we are? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, who benefits when we choose comfort over revision? Because in politics, certainty is powerful. It mobilizes, it unifies, it simplifies, but it also closes. Democracy does not collapse when people are ignorant. It weakens when people are certain. When certainty replaces curiosity, when allegiance replaces inquiry, when identity replaces evidence. And if we want stronger democracies, we may need to become more comfortable with discomfort.